Hello, I'm Nick Cheeseman, a fellow at the Australian National University, and together with April Bickham, I co-convene the Interpretation Method and Critique group there. And what you're about to hear is a recording of the second in a series of talks on rethinking interpretive methods organized by our group, held on October 29, 2001. I'm re-recording the introduction because, as you're going to hear, I was sitting outside when we actually had our conversation, and at some points it got quite blustery and hard to hear what I was saying. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that the Australian National University is on land that was colonised by settlers, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, past, present and emerging. The topic that we address in this discussion is Misunderstanding Ethnography, Evidence in Law, Journalism and Political Ethnography. And it comes out of a dialogue that was held at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association in 2018, and also subsequently a special dialogue in the Politics Groups and Identities Journal, the current issue at the time of the discussion, that is volume 9, number 4. There were 5 contributors to this special dialogue in Politics, Groups and Identities, myself and 3 other people that we'll be hearing from shortly. One is Sharon Batt, an adjunct professor in bioethics and political science at Dalhousie University in Canada. Another, David Forrest, an assistant professor of politics at Oberlin College in the United States. And Anastasia Shesternina. She's a lecturer in politics at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And in mentioning her, I'd especially like to note that she has a new book out with Cornell University called Mobilizing in Uncertainty, Collective Identities and War in Abkhazia. So do take a look at that. In addition, we had really as the organizer of the dialogue, the person who was instrumental in getting us together and also in getting us to publication, Professor Deborah Janau from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, who unfortunately, due to the difficulties of working across 5 different time zones, wasn't able to come together with us for this discussion. Let me begin by saying a couple of things about what it is that we're doing with this dialogue, both in writing and the discussion that follows, Misunderstanding Ethnography. The dialogue is a response to a publication from 2017 by Stephen Lubet, a professor of law at Northwestern University in Chicago. And Lubet published a book titled Interrogating Ethnography, Why Evidence Matters. I'll read from the back jacket of the book to give you a sense of its contents, as described by the author and publisher. Urban ethnography is one of the most vibrant areas of social science inquiry and has produced scores of classic books over the decades. Yet, when Stephen Lubet delved deeper into the literature, he encountered a field that relies heavily on anonymous sources, often as reported by a single investigator, whose underlying data remain unseen. Upon digging into the details, he discovered too many ethnographic assertions that were dubious, exaggerated, tendentious, or just plain wrong. Employing the tools and techniques of a trial lawyer, Lubet uses original sources and contemporaneous documentation to explore the stories behind ethnographic narratives. As he shows, many classic works in the field are accurate and indeed powerful works of scholarship. However, he also found many others that relied far too much on rumors, folklore, and unreliable hearsay. Interrogating Ethnography explains how qualitative social science would benefit from greater attention to the quality of evidence and provides recommendations for bringing the field more closely in line with other fact-based disciplines such as law and journalism. So there are 2 things to note about that book in getting us started in the discussion that follows. First of all, Lubet proposes that by interrogating ethnography, he will be able to offer up ways of thinking and working better, methodologically at least, for the purposes of trustworthiness, a term that I'll return to momentarily, in ethnographic inquiry. In fact, his text is focused not on ethnography at large, but rather quite specifically on United States-based urban sociological ethnographic work. And the reason for this is that it's motivated by a series of responses from Lubet to Alice Goffman's book On the Run, a book that especially irritated him for a variety of reasons and led him into a sustained critique, first of all, of that text, and then out of it to address what he saw as some of the deficiencies of other related texts. So that's the scope of the book that we were responding to. Secondarily, in terms of its goal, Lubet's primary interest is in making a case, advocating for ethnographers to be more like lawyers in their standards of evidence, in their methods for assessing the veracity of the data that they generate, and so on. And hence, Misunderstanding Ethnography as the rubric that we used for our own discussions. Our concern was to point out that ethnographic work, epistemologically, methodologically, is not the same as the work of the lawyer for good reasons. That's not in any way to dismiss the work of the lawyer, but to point out that the ethnographer has different objectives, has a different philosophy associated with their inquiries from that of the lawyer. And each of us went about it in a variety of different ways. Devora Yanov concentrated on basic questions of methodology, writing, and ethics. Sharon Batt addressed the question of journalism and how Lubet uses the work of journalists to make a case for an alternative approach to ethnographic inquiry. And she, based on her long-standing experience as a journalist, argues that he misunderstands journalism as well as ethnography. Anastasia Shestranina concentrates on evidence, openness, and trustworthiness. And David looks at Lubet's American creed. That's to say, he argues that there is an ideological content to the mode of responding to Goffman's work in particular, and ethnographic work in general, that is not properly acknowledged by Lubet, and he tries to draw that out and then offer a critique of the text on that basis. To get us going, we decided to turn to a number of keywords and use those keywords for our discussion. And the first one of those keywords, which I've alluded to already, is trustworthiness. So the question that I asked to the group at the outset was, how do we design for trustworthiness in ethnographic research? And we turned to Anastasia for an opening response. So Anastasia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for the introduction, for bringing us together, and Nick and April for hosting us all. I'd like to start by mentioning something that Devora shared with us in a collective correspondence, that trustworthiness can stem from a range of sources: reputation, track record, institutional affiliation, you name it. But here I'd like to emphasize that we as researchers can take specific steps to build trustworthiness in our own research, but that these steps are not generic. They depend on the particular context of the research. And once again, going back to Devora's contribution in the introduction, she does stress this in the conclusion to that introduction in the dialogue. A pluralist political science, she says, requires recognizing that different methodologies advance different standards. No single scientific standard exists against which ethnographic research should or must be measured. And this is a very important starting point. So what is clear to me is that first and foremost, we need to put trust in the researcher and her in-depth knowledge of the context that she studies, rather than in external verification and replication by editors, reviewers, fellow researchers, as Lubet suggests, because those individuals' background and research experience can actually generate a different interpretation of the same data. And in my case, the specific steps that I took in working on Abkhaz mobilization in the Georgian-Abkhaz War of 1992-93 are multiple, but I'll stress two. First, what I did is to leverage multiple sources of evidence from semi-structured life history interviews with participants and non-participants in the war in Abkhazia, additional interviews with witnesses, experts in Georgia and Russia, participation in everyday life, war-related events, as well as official documents, news and video materials, and secondary sources. And so what this range of materials helped me achieve is to contextualize the data that I was collecting, to check what I heard, saw, and read in one source against others, to understand the phenomenon from different perspectives, and very importantly, to get a sense of how evidence was generated. And this is something that Nick in this dialogue also stresses, similarly coupling the data that he generated from official documents with interviews, news reports, trial observations, which helped him as well understand the politics of the production of paperwork in Myanmar and Thailand. So for me, the strategy of leveraging different sources increased my confidence in these materials and ultimately helped me develop an in-depth understanding of the process of Abkhaz mobilization. But I also needed to communicate this and other methods to my readers. And so secondly, what I did is I engaged in a range of transparency practices, focusing on what Lauren McLean and co-authors call reflexive openness or sustained reflection on my ethical research practice. So what I did is I provided extended contextualized interview excerpts from my fieldwork and a detailed description of my data production and analysis processes in both published texts, but also methodological appendices, and also reflected on things that Liu Bei would not even accept, on the emotional dynamics of the challenging fieldwork in an isolated de facto Abkhaz state in the South Caucasus. And so I needed to explain to the reader once again how these dynamics affected my data and my conclusions. So what this has helped achieve is to kind of facilitate evaluation of my findings in what Butte and Jacobs call replication in thought, in that I walked the reader through my interpretations, helped them trace my interpretations together with me from the moment of the research design through the process of data collection and analysis, while prioritizing the safety of my research participants, which of course other forms of transparency such as data sharing, which Liu Bei calls for, would have jeopardized. But again, going back to the point that I started with, it's really important to stress that this is one way in which we could approach increasing trustworthiness in our research. Alternatively, for instance, in this dialogue, what we saw is that Sharon in her research on breast cancer movement actually decided to make different choices, to name some companies and activists she worked with. And once again, this decision was informed by her deep understanding of the context in which she worked, which brings us back to the trust in the researcher that is essential in this kind of research, and the ethnographic sensibility that the researcher develops to help them make these decisions. So these are some early reflections that I wanted to throw out there and perhaps invite maybe some reactions from Nick and Sharon, given that I've drawn on their research here. Would you suggest that this resonates with how you have increased your own confidence in your findings and kind of communicated them to others? What's your stance on that?
I can jump in. One of the things I like the fact that you brought out, Anastasia, that there's no kind of one specific way in ethnographic research to develop trust. One of the things I had to cope with was I had been a very engaged activist in the community that I was studying, and I also had taken a public point of view on the very issue that I was wanting to investigate further, which was groups taking funding from drug companies. So I was going into a very polarized environment. I wanted to hear from the activists who were taking money from drug companies, but they had to trust me, even knowing that I had taken a different point of view. One of the things I did to try to, I struggled with this at the beginning, was how was I going to do this? And I came across an ethnography by a woman in the United States who had studied the pro-life movement, and she was very much a pro-choice advocate. And one of the things she said that she did was when she approached people that she wanted to interview, was she got them to start out by telling their whole story about, their life and how they got interested in the issue. And, so she really contextualized each interview. She didn't jump right into the whole contentious part. And then in her write-up, she was very, gave detailed sort of histories of the various people she had interviewed. So that was helpful to me. I didn't follow exactly her plan, but I had that idea in mind, that I wanted to depict the community as one where people were thoughtful, regardless of which point of view they took. There was a lot of debate within the groups when the issue of drug company money came up. There was, there were these internal struggles and fights in some cases within the groups. But I try to depict that all very fairly, not only, of course, to get the trust of the people I was interviewing, but to have the trust of the readers, that I wasn't just, out there to hammer my own point of view. And also, as Anastasia mentioned, the whole question of whether to anonymize the people I was speaking to. I actually, in my dissertation work, I did anonymize the speaker, I think all the speakers, except for one who happened to be a very high profile politician. And it would have been obvious to anybody who knew Canadian politics who she was. But then when I wrote the book, I actually, the publisher hired a defamation lawyer to go over my text, and he gave me this whole 25 questions with subparts, and it was a bit loobity in the sense that it was, what evidence do you have for this, and do you have documentation for that, and so that was quite interesting. The whole issue of anonymity, whether to anonymize or not. Most of the people I interviewed, the lawyer wanted me to name people. He said it's better to name them, and from his point of view. And most people said, no, I'm fine with that. I never, these are people who are used to speaking to the media, and, they were high profile activists. So that was the whole issue of anonymity was quite an interesting one to work through.
Yeah, so most of us have been involved in sort of thinking through this discussion with Lubet in a speculative sense, but you've actually been in conversation with a lawyer about your work and thinking through the implications of it. Can I ask you, and perhaps then this also goes back to what Anastasia was saying, and David, I'd like to invite you either to come in on this point or open up another one of those that we have. But Sharon, one of the things that Dvora Yano and Perry Schwartz say in their interpretive research design recommend as a possible route also for trustworthiness is checking with members themselves on their views on your interpretations. In other words, going back to them. And you seem to have been in an especially suitable location to do that, in as much as you were already, in a sense, a member of many of those communities that you were speaking to, right? So was that something that you did or contemplated doing in order then also to develop the quality of the trustworthiness?
I didn't do a real member checking exercise, partly because I really was concerned about people pulling out, because I knew that, this continues to be quite a controversial issue within the community. I did contact each person and read to them the parts of the quote, the particular quotes from their interviews that I wanted to use and some of the context around it. But I didn't feel like, I was afraid the whole project would fall apart if I really gave people access to the whole, I was a bit discreet. I'm not sure Dvora would have approved.
Yeah, in my case, I did not do member checking, but for a slightly different reason. I had brought it up, something, I didn't call it member checking, obviously, but with a couple of people. Oh, whoops, my light went off. There we go. I brought it up with a couple people, and more or less the indication I got was that would be a complete waste of their time, and they had already given me enough time for my book. So, like, why would they give me even more time? Like, they weren't interested in doing it. You know, that was sort of more my thing, and you know, but the way I've always thought about that, because it is something, you know, I'd be interested in doing, is not so much that it's like, because I think like maybe the sort of Lubit type of approach to member checking would be like, these people are telling you whether or not you got something right or not, or something like that. Whereas for me, it's more interesting in as much as it provides, like, seeing their response to your interpretations of them provides in some ways like an even additional layer of evidence that you can analyze that may not, like, I don't think they get to, you know, like, you know, in Sharon's case, had she done like member checking, someone could have very well said, you know, you're implying this thing, I don't think it's true, I don't want you to write that. And just because the person you were studying thinks like it's not correct doesn't mean it's not, right? But it is interesting, like, if it doesn't destroy the project or they don't consider it a waste of their time, you know, to get those reactions, I think, just to have that sort of, again, added layer of reflection that you can kind of dive into. And one of the coolest things ever, I thought, on those lines, in terms of increasing the trustworthiness of the book and everything, was one of Elliot Lebo's books, who's of course a famous ethnographer, actually did this thing where he did some of this kind of member checking, got like quotes, and then put like what people said in the footnotes. So you could sort of see the dialogue between, you know, his account and their response or whatever. But anyways, yeah.
That's fascinating. And you picked up on a really important point, which gets at this misunderstanding of ethnography on Lubet's part. It's exactly your point, is that he wants to say there are objective social facts out there, and it's important that we go out and then establish whether or not they've been correctly, shall we say, documented. Whereas the ethnographic problem is, have I got the intersubjective meaning making right, if you will, right? How can I ask questions about how I've understood what someone has said, and whether or not there might be another way to think about the meaning of that, and whether indeed there may be multiple meanings that would be relevant. And this gets to one of the other keywords that we had on our list, and that is interpretation, and of course a key term for this group as well. What is it that Lube is doing that he's missing the point with interpretation? Why is it that for him there's a difficulty grasping how the interpretive work of the ethnographer differs from that of the lawyer? Perhaps there's a relationship between questions of interpretation and questions of power that we were also interested to discuss. Hey, David, as you're still on my screen, I don't know if you'd like to pick up on this. It seems relevant from a number of points of view to your piece, including the hierarchies of credibility of Becker, which I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say about that, and like, I mean, my sort of take on Lubit's sort of inability to grasp certain kind of modes of interpretation or what have you that are more common among at least a certain kind of ethnographer. I mean, for me, it really, yeah, a lot of it comes down to, I guess a psychologist would call it motivated reasoning or something like that. Like, he just, you know, he has a particular sort of, you know, like prior view of who, I mean, in some ways this actually gets back to the trustworthiness thing, because like, you know, and Anastasia mentions this in her piece, he has this clear like hierarchy of, you know, credibility that he well, there's an explicit one where he says, like, you know, the top is documentary evidence, then firsthand accounts, then secondhand accounts, and then there's like the underlying unspoken one, which is, to the extent we're dealing with these different things, we always give the sort of the official and the professional accounts, you know, trustworthiness and credibility, you know, over the others. So it's just like, it almost feels like to me that, you know, he just doesn't think what, you know, the kinds of things a lot of ethnographers study, like, sort of the role of hearsay and rumors in constructing, people's understandings of the world or whatever. It just seems like he kind of isn't, like, he just isn't interested in it. He really, like, he wants to sort of take down a particular set of criticisms of the US kind of social order, and getting into all this other stuff about interpretation would be sort of a distraction from that goal for him. So yeah, I mean, but clearly he's operating with like too much of a kind of constrained understanding of what we do when we interpret. But I'll let someone else talk.
Anastasia, did you want to come in on questions of interpretation, or relatedly the power relationships, which must have been extremely significant in the sites in which you were doing your research?
Absolutely. I think there is an assumption of somewhat of a raw data in Lubet's understanding of what data is, from which we can draw conclusions, and if we do that correctly, we draw them right. And we should draw the same conclusions no matter our background, no matter our research experience, no matter the constellation of the knowledge of the case that we had developed, and a range of contextual factors in which we had developed that. So, as once again Devorah's piece points out, and I think that's not the introduction, that's the paper, it's a realist objectivist starting point that orients the entire book. And of course, if we start unpacking this notion of raw data, what we find is that no raw data actually exists outside of the context of spending time with the participants in our research, with the space in which we conduct our research. And that space, in my case, was an essential component of interpretation. So I conducted my research, as I mentioned, in a highly challenging, isolated environment where I was the only international researcher, and where exit and entry are incredibly difficult. And so I had experienced power relations in situ in various ways, including by fearing many of my research participants. And that, of course, shaped what I could ask, what my participants answered, what they told me, what they shared with me in private versus in public, what they shared with me at a wedding celebration, as opposed to in the context of a semi-structured life history interview. And so, without thinking through, really systematically reflecting on that fear, or on the other hand, empathies that I developed with other participants in my research, I would not have come to the conclusions that I had developed. And perhaps another individual in the same environment would have experienced the research setting in a completely different way, and the power relations also in a completely different way, based on their background, based on their identifiers, and various forms of our own position in the field. And this is where we go from raw data to interpretation, I think. And this is where it becomes clear that that raw data, which is idealized in Lubet's narrative, actually does not exist. And if it were, it wouldn't lead to the same conclusions, because we would all experience it in different ways. And that doesn't mean that we do not come up with not factual accounts. It means that what we're aiming toward is something different, to uncover the meanings, the shared meanings with which people live through events that we study, or phenomena that we study. And this, as a goal, I think, is what motivated at least my research. What about you, Sharon? I think you would have quite a lot to say also on the power relations side of things and the interpretation that resulted.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I was doing in my essay was picking up on Lubet's comparison of journalism and ethnography and the different standards of evidence. And what he didn't seem to ever get at was the fact that a lot of journalism is about kind of calling the powerful to account, and that, you know, that's one of the reasons why you do have to be careful about your evidence, and there are always, you know, issues of libel and so on, and so there's a certain amount of concern about being able to have multiple sources stating the same kind of thing. Whereas in ethnography, we're more often studying the vulnerable and people who are not so powerful, although they have their own sources of power, of course. So he didn't ever discuss that aspect of power and the responsibility that the ethnographer has to respect the safety and the possible negative impact of the researcher on, particularly on the person who, is really just living their life and you want to know about it, as opposed to the person that is, say, a politician or somebody wielding power in the community and, where it's accepted that your research might cause them to lose their job or, have very negative consequences. So you have very different standards of ethics as well as evidence.
I'm wondering, how do we design, though, to attend to the power relationships in ways that you've both just been referring to? It sounds to me like in some ways we rely upon both a willingness to recognize that those relations exist, that those hierarchies of credibility, to use Becker's terms, exist, and to attend to them in locations where they will become evidence through observation and conversation. But is that necessarily the case? So presumably still someone could engage in research that may be, say, participant observational in its character, that nevertheless may be inattentive to power relations. So what do we do to design for them? And relatedly, this I think will be my last intervention, how do we write them out? I think one of the characteristics of Lubet's work, and perhaps work of other scholars like him, is that it's so evident to us as to how he's aligning power relations. So again and again, that hierarchy of credibility is present in his work, the way that he always goes back to a police officer or a public prosecutor or some other person in an official position in order to establish the veracity or not of somebody else's statement, right? That for Lubet is what counts in terms of the truthfulness of facts, of social facts, if you will. How do we then, in our own writing, think not only about writing differently, if you will, and creatively, something Anastasia was discussing before we got started about her own work, but also writing out in a way that reveals through the writing process itself those hierarchies of credibility and the power relations that adhere to the settings in which we're doing our work. So in short, two aspects to the question. One is designing to attend to them in the field site, if you will, and the other in the writing out exercise. Again, Sharon, you're still on my screen, so maybe start with you and you can nominate one of the other discussants. Thank you.
Gosh, that's a big question. big question. I'm not sure. I'm gonna punt to David because I don't. My thoughts aren't coherent at the moment.
It is a big question. It is a big question. I mean, I think, and my thoughts aren't necessarily coherent either. But I think it starts for me. It starts with, at least in my own work, making this basic shift in what I understand the purpose of research to be. And, I think when I was a graduate student, it felt like, and this is kind of also in some ways, yeah, I mean, my overall sort of beef with Lubet is that, the assumption is that the purpose of research is to provide these ever more precise kind of accounts of the world as it is and how it operates. And I always sort of felt like, well, no, I feel like the purpose of research, what I want to do is, trouble settled and kind of problematic terms of debate. Or what I want to do with research is denaturalize, kind of oppressive, my light keeps going off, denaturalize, oppressive socio-political arrangements and, start from there and then think about, okay, how can I sort of build an ethnography that can help me do that? And I think there are a few different ways. You know, one thing that I think ethnography is particularly good at, although it's not the only tool for doing this, is, you know, trying to, you know, uncover, you know, perspectives on, that aren't often shared, right? Just, you know, and sort of bring forth, you know, kind of ideas and facts that are inconvenient for whatever, you know, make that your orientation, you know, that are maybe inconvenient for whatever the sort of, you know, problematic order is. And then the other thing that I think is really helpful that, again, ethnography is particularly well suited for is looking at process and practices through which things, again, like power relations get reproduced or, you know, transformed or whatever, you know, actually tracing, you know, again, the actual kind of concrete practices through which things are made and thus sort of render them more contingent. So, I mean, that's kind of, you know, how I think of it. It starts with, I mean, there's no way to get outside of, obviously, like, you know, so I don't think probably any of us have this belief that you can kind of control for power or something like that and then get it reality. But I do think you can start your whole process and your whole project from kind of an alternative relationship, you know, to power. And that's kind of where I start, I guess. But yeah.
Could I jump in here and actually take us back even to a prior point than that which David was discussing now, namely designing the design. and that is important for me because that's where some of the designing to attend to power relations happened in my case, where I was incredibly fortunate to be able to conduct a preliminary trip before my long-term presence in Abkhazia, where I actually started asking questions that I was supposed to develop in my dissertation that at the time in my subfield, I'm in civil war studies, was really undiscovered, which was post-war violence. And what I learned was that nobody wanted to talk to me about that. Every single person I had asked about post-war violence either shied away from the conversation altogether or started talking about other things. And I had to accept that change in the field and introduce that into my research design. And in fact, through being true to my conversations in the preliminary trip, I actually managed to find a question that has truly motivated me and that has been met with a range of reactions, but certainly not of the kind that I had initially had to the questions of post-war violence. That is, how is it that ordinary people navigate these incredibly difficult moments, such as the onset of a war? And so I think that kind of flexibility and adaptability during field work in designing and redesigning the research, that is something that can help attend to power dynamics, I think, at the design stage. And I think the other component is ongoing ethical awareness, which is something that Liane Fuji had explored, examined in her own work and has taught us. We cannot go into the field with an understanding of ethics as fixed. Circumstances change, especially in politicized, around politicized questions in sensitive areas and challenging contexts. And so, of course, our ethical understanding of what is going on has to change as well. And so some of the decisions that I had made in the field, for instance, not to conduct certain interviews in the areas where I had planned to conduct them, or to reorient certain activities, those were directly in response to what I had observed and the kind of the ethnographic sensibility that I was developing in the process. And had I only attended to power relations as I had written them out in my ethics application, I don't think that would be true to the circumstances. I think I'll stop here. We can discuss the writing up process as well, but if there are other questions, we could shift to them.
Well, I think, Sharon, you may want to come back in on this point still, but I think maybe let's open up, because we only have about less than 20 minutes remaining for the discussion with everyone in the room. Farah Godrej has already put a note in the chat, and Farah, I'd invite you to come on and speak to that comment if you'd like to, because I think that relates directly to what Anastasia was just saying. But anyone else, if you do want to raise a comment or a question, make a comment or raise a question, then please just raise your electronic hand, the hand in Zoom, because I apologize that I cannot see everyone's faces on the screen today. So please do that, or put a comment or a question into the chat. But Farah, would you like to speak to the point that you noted in the chat, because it really does, I think, directly address Anastasia's remarks?
Sure. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm on a set of headphones that may or may not be working. Can I just see a thumbs up? Can you hear me?
I can't hear you very well myself. Can anyone else hear Farah?
Okay, how about now?
No.
Any better?
That's better. It's better.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'll keep speaking, and then if you are unable to hear me, please let me know in the chat. Really, just to, I guess, reiterate, what I say in the chat, which is that when you study groups like incarcerated or formerly incarcerated persons, I often encounter, I'll be citing an interview excerpt or, saying something descriptive in an ethnographic account, relaying something said by a formerly incarcerated or a currently incarcerated person, and immediately, I'll face a reaction like, oh, well, these people lie all the time, or we cannot accord any credibility to what we learn in our research with these groups, because look who you're studying. Whereas, if I'm interviewing or relaying something I learned from a prison administrator, right, suddenly that is treated with a different kind, met with a different, sort of credulity, if you will. So so just to say that, I forget where we saw this, the stuff about studying up or studying down. I know that Dvor and Perry, make reference to that all the time, but it just seems to me we should be thinking all the time about, are we studying up? Are we studying down? And then how does that, right, modulate or inflect how we sort of work with the data, so to speak. So I'll just leave it there, and I hope I was, the tech was not too bad.
I think Laura Nader wrote an essay, I think it was way back in the 60s, encouraging ethnographers to study up while she was speaking to anthropologists. And there hasn't been a lot of research. I mean, it's not the dominant kind of research in ethnography where you study up. And I think it's partly because it's hard to get people in power to open up. At least I've read one essay that talked about that. In my research, I did have, as I said, a former cabinet minister and somebody who worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and I had a couple of people who worked in the government decision making relating to patient groups. So I did have different kind of levels, but I also realized and wanted to bring out in my research that the people who become leaders in patient advocacy are quite powerful. They have become quite powerful. They're not the average patient who is, looking to just deal with a crisis in their life, who joins a group. So I tried to make that distinction also in my research.
One thing I would add to this discussion, which I think is always a good one. And if anyone hasn't ever read Howard Becker's old essay, Whose Side Are We On?, which is the one that's been referenced, that is like where a lot of this, it's been referenced here a couple of times. I think it's a really good essay. that at least a couple of us cite in our papers in this dialogue. But anyways, what I wanted to say is this topic comes up all the time when I'm talking to, I have these discussions with my students. You know, I teach mainly about US politics and a lot about kind of interest groups and social movements. And I always talk to them about how when we talk about, you know, groups of more ordinary people participating in politics, we immediately sort of dive into questions about, you know, how they sort of construct views of the world and how that can shape their behavior in certain kinds of counterproductive ways, and how like they're very like, you know, we talk about them in these ways that, you know, very much, you know, I don't know what the word is, like they're seen as people who could potentially, you know, have, you know, whatever, for whom things like social constructions matter a lot, I guess. Whereas when we talk about, you know, like corporate lobbyists or the people funding them, we automatically make this assumption that like their interests or whatever are totally transparent to them. They like operate as these kind of rational actors. And I always talk about how that seems like it's just because of the way we're able to study them, right? Like, I'm sure, you know, when you actually get people who are able to do a little bit more kind of qualitative / sometimes interpretive work with these people, you see that they're not that different in terms of, you know, this kind of thing from ordinary people. It's just that, yeah, when you go study, you know, like, you know, I study social justice organizations. Yeah, you can easily walk into a church basement where some advocacy group is meeting and say, hey, can I observe you? But you can't walk into the corporate lobbyist's office and just start watching, you know? So, yeah, I think it's important. And I think it has to be kind of accounted for in, not just in research, but just like even after the fact, in reading research and talking about our fields of study more broadly. You know.
Thanks, David. Are there other questions or comments that people have? Again, raise your hand or just take your mic off and call out, or put a note in the chat. Kai Wilkinson.
Hi everyone, sorry, just let me put my hand down before I forget, because that's always really irritating. So thank you so much for this discussion. It's been lovely to sort of hear the reflections and different perspectives on things. To pick up on David's point, I mean, one of the things that also complicates this is that we're often studying groups where there is power and marginalization simultaneously, and it's the challenges of capturing that when we have so much nuance and understanding of it, when from an outsider's perspective it tends to be reduced to they're powerful, they're not, rather than being able to interrogate the different ways in which power can be exercised and engaged with it. I think this is one of the things that come through with Lubet's misunderstanding of Goffman's work, is the temptation to position people as victims, or else, you know, people who resist power in particular ways, is certainly one that both complicates our endeavor but is also very central to it. And if we're able to do that effectively, we have to exist in that gray zone of the complicated bits, the messy bits, rather than the reductionist accounts that Lubet wants. Certainly, I mean, I come from a background studying LGBT communities within Central Asia, former Soviet Union, and we're looking at massively complicated and multiple power dynamics. And that's before we get onto the standard positionality accounts. So how we understand our respondent groups, how we group them, how we portray them, is going to be another very key question in terms of mapping their positionalities as well as our own. Of course, this leads us on to huge logistical challenges of how do we put all of this into formats that are acceptable for articles, that are acceptable for thesis as well. You know, so there's going to have to be a degree of selection, but keeping that heterogeneity and keeping the complexity of it, I think, is very, very important, and something to be prioritized as a way of making sense of power itself as well.
Maybe if I can come back on the writing out a question which I had before. And Kai, I'd welcome it if you'd respond to this, or any one of the discussants. Then, what are the implications with writing out? It seems that there are a range of different strategies, that there are some scholars, Leanne Fucci is an example, although not strictly speaking an ethnographer, who really foregrounded everything that she did in the field, the choices that she made, who she worked with, and everything's there right up front. In other cases, as in Goffman's work, and this seems to be one of the issues that people had, she had this very lengthy methodological appendix where you could go to and find things that, from the point of view of a critic like Lubet, ought to have been set out at the beginning and established the terms for the work. There are other writers, perhaps in some ways, Patirat's a bit like this. In every 12 seconds, he relies on the ethnography to do the work itself, right? If you haven't caught what he's doing methodologically, you're not reading close enough. Go back and have another look, and you'll see that it's all there. You just need to be paying attention. So I'm wondering, for each one of our discussants, what are the implications then for your writing out practices, for the organization of your writing, and then the particular.
I could come in on that. It was a difficult choice, I think, in the dissertation and then in the book. But I find that the choice that I had made to immediately launch into the question of studying Civil War mobilization, from those changes, early changes that I had already shared with you, to the approach to seeking former participants and non-participants in the war, to the decision about the sites within Abkhazia, to the various emotional contextual dynamics. So all of that is up front, because I do not want to ever suggest that I am speaking on behalf or through the voices of the people who had shared with me. I'm speaking based on what I had understood, given the constellation of this research and my own background, of course, and the various relationships that I had developed. And those relationships are, as a result, front and forward, before I can move on to sharing some of what I had learned. When I share what I had learned from this position on, then it is easier for me to establish a more honest conversation, because it is clear, my starting point is clear. And then what I do in the book is, regardless of the theoretical situation in the field, it is the insights from the field work, in the field as in my field of study. It is the insights from the field work that guide the discussion. So for instance, it would be easy for me to dismiss some of the constantly emerging themes, because they really do not sit comfortably with much of mobilization research. And it is a really difficult process to not dismiss them and to have those insights guide the conversation. But that is another choice that I had made. So for instance, having realized that many participants actually understood the threat that they were facing in different ways, we don't quite have much out there to help us theoretically with that. I had to put that front and forward once again, and write things out from there on, and engage with theory from there on, rather than vice versa. But again, that's just my own, in my own case.
One of the things I've alluded to this already was I had been engaged in the community and continued to some extent to be engaged in the community I was studying, and I did put that right up front. And I thought, I mean, that speaks to the fact that the researcher has a position of power in shaping the story, and I wanted to make it make that my engagement and my interest, my position clear pretty much from the outset. Another thing that I had to grapple with, well, all through the book, I had to decide how much of myself do I put in, where do I, kind of leave it to the other participants. I don't want to take over the story. But there was also the question of, I was trying to show the the political environment as a sort of an actor in this whole sort of a drama that took place over a period of 2 decades, and I was describing the changes. And I had to kind of go back and forth between, you know, the groups, which, you know, the discussions within the groups and the quotes people said, oh, that was where it was really fun and lively. And whereas I had these sort of drier sections where I was trying to describe the politics and how the politics evolved and interacted, you know, sort of in some ways shaped what was going on in the groups. So that was another decision I had to make in the writing, was how to balance and intertwine those 2 parts of my story.
Farah, please come in, and this will be the last question before we close. Thanks.
Is my sound okay?
Yeah.
Good. I love those nods. It's more of a comment really than a question, just to say that I'm really appreciating the way in which our entire conversation is highlighting and centering the question of sort of autoethnographic reflections on positionality. And I'm really appreciating that in both, you know, Anastasia and Sharon's comments, as well as David, I think in yours as well, which is that, you know, in all of these different issues that we've been discussing, they all seem to be inevitably intertwined with the question of researcher positionality and the researcher's self-conscious reflection, right? I mean, and this goes back to Becker's question of whose side are we on, right? And I sort of think of prison researchers who say, like, anytime you're studying prisons and mass incarceration, you have to be very self-conscious about taking a position and not pretending as though, right, you come to these issues of social justice from some kind of absurdly neutral, you know, God's eye view or what have you. So I think in different ways, this conversation is just bringing home to me the critical importance of that self-conscious reflection on positionality. So thank you to all of you.
Well, thank you very much. And so I think on that note of enthusiasm and encouragement, I'd just like to thank all of the participants in the discussion today for being involved, everyone who came to join, but the discussants especially. Can I just get a word of a closing from each one of you, a nod, a thanks or something, please?
Well, thanks, Nick, for organizing this. It was quite a feat getting us all together, given that we're in, you know, 4 different countries.
Thanks so much. Great discussion. So good to see you all again. And I hope we have more opportunities in the future.
Yep, appreciate you all. Thanks so much, Nick. Yes, and April for putting this together. And, you know, yeah, don't buy Lubit's book.
That's ironic, because in order to conduct our work, we had to. And I really do appreciate all of you making the time to do this at, as you indicated, different times in different places in the world. It's a shame that we couldn't have Devora with us because of the time differences, but nevertheless. I myself apologize again that I was in a windy location, and I'm going to try and get into my office for next week's event. That will be Rethinking Comparison, a discussion arising out of the new co-edited volume by Nick Rush-Smith and Erica Simmons, with both of the editors of that volume and myself. So I'm looking forward to being indoors and having some of you with me then next week. Thank you all very much for coming.